A young cavalry lieutenant was leading a small patrol along the Rosebud River in eastern Montana. It was a hot and windy day. Sergeant Evans was unusually quiet. Later that afternoon, he rode up alongside Lieutenant MacRae and said, "Is this your first patrol, Lieutenant?" Lieutenant MacRae looked at the sergeant with a frown and said, "Yes, it is, Sergeant. Why do you ask? Are you worried about my lack of combat experience?" "Well, I really don't give a damn about your experience, but we may run into a Sioux war party, and there are a few things you ought to know," said Sergeant Evans. "Like what?" said the lieutenant. "Well, for starters, if we get into it with the Sioux, save the last bullet for yourself," said Sergeant Evans. "Yeah, I heard that one at the point," said the lieutenant with a smirk. Sergeant Evans looked at the lieutenant in the eye and said, "Sounds like you think I'm joking, Lieutenant." It was a hot and humid day in June when 42 cadets were commissioned second lieutenants at West Point. Lieutenant John MacRae would graduate second in his class. He looked through the crowd of spectators and did not see his parents. He was disappointed but not surprised. His father barely spoke to him after he announced that he would be going to West Point. That was 4 years ago. John MacRae's father had a thriving cigar factory in Milwaukee, and he counted on his son John to run the business so he could retire. At 17 years of age, John MacRae went to a business school in Chicago for 2 years. Then he started working for his father. He worked in a cigar factory for 1 year. Although the financial rewards were substantial, John MacRae could not see himself running a cigar factory for the rest of his life. With his business experience and schooling, John MacRae easily passed the entrance exam at West Point. John MacRae was of average height, but in excellent physical condition, so the physical requirements at West Point posed no problems for him. John MacRae's appearance could be deceiving. He had delicate features and wore his dark brown hair on the long side. Depending on his mood, John MacRae could appear either strong or weak. This would plague him in his years at West Point and beyond. Women, however, would find John MacRae charming and attractive. John MacRae laughed when a young woman said that he resembled Michelangelo's statue of David. John MacRae always hated his appearance. He wished that he was taller and had blonde hair. The speaker at the commencement exercises was Frederick Stanley, the Secretary of War. Stanley talked about Western expansion and his perceived issues with Native Americans. Stanley, who was a conservative, took a hard line in his speech and mentioned another West Point graduate, George Armstrong Custer. During Stanley's speech, Lieutenant MacRae recalled a conversation with a visiting sergeant who was on the burial detail at the Little Bighorn battlefield. The sergeant described the condition of the bodies and the mutilations in great detail. Some of the cadets thought he was exaggerating and laughed at the sergeant. It was then when the sergeant said, "Don't ever let yourself get captured by the Sioux or Apache. Save that last bullet for yourself. They have ways of keeping you alive for days while they torture you." The sergeant went on to describe some of the torture methods. The cadets stopped laughing. 2 weeks after graduation, Lieutenant MacRae was given a 3-week furlough. Lieutenant MacRae decided to return to Milwaukee one more time to bid farewell to his parents and await his orders. Lieutenant MacRae was home for 5 days when he received his orders. His first posting would be with the 7th Cavalry at Fort Keogh in eastern Montana. His reception at home was cold, and he grew tired of his father's constant belittlement. He decided to leave early for Montana and see some sights along the way. Lieutenant MacRae left Milwaukee without saying goodbye to his father. When he kissed his mother goodbye, she broke out in tears and said, "Johnny, I fear I'll never see you again." He boarded a train in Milwaukee and headed for Montana. Lieutenant MacRae stopped in South Dakota near Sturgis to purchase a horse. Construction had begun on Fort Meade, and a few horse traders had already arrived from Kentucky and Virginia. He purchased a brown sorrel and named it Mac. Lieutenant MacRae had plenty of time left, so he decided to ride Mac out to Fort Keogh. Lieutenant MacRae arrived at Fort Keogh in July of 1878. Sergeant Evans was a giant of a man, standing over 6 foot 5 inches tall and weighing 260 pounds. He had a rugged appearance with a gray beard and long gray hair. A narrow black streak ran down the center of his gray hair. Sergeant Evans had a loud, booming voice and loved to intimidate his fellow troopers, especially new and inexperienced officers. Lieutenant MacRae was not intimidated by Sergeant Evans. Lieutenant MacRae halted his horse and said, "Let's make camp tonight in that grove of trees over yonder, Sergeant." "Your call, Lieutenant," said Sergeant Evans, emphasizing the word lieutenant. That evening, after camp was set up and the evening meal was finished, Lieutenant MacRae gathered the patrol around the campfire to discuss their mission. He walked up to Sergeant Evans and said, "Why haven't you posted a sentry yet, Sergeant?" "We don't need any sentries. We're not even close to Indian country, sir," said Sergeant Evans, emphasizing the word sir. "Post one anyway, Sergeant," said Lieutenant MacRae in a stern voice. "Whatever you say, sir," said Sergeant Evans, again emphasizing the word sir. Lieutenant MacRae described the mission to the 6-man patrol, which consisted of Sergeant Evans, Corporal Dunn, Privates Wilhelm, Howard, Leone, and Nelson. Only Sergeant Evans and Corporal Dunn had seen any actual combat. Lieutenant MacRae said, "Our mission is simple. There have been reports of Red Eagle's band harassing homesteaders west of here on the Rosebud River. We are to make contact with any settlers in the area and confirm these reports. We have specific orders not to engage any Indians." Sergeant Evans spit into the fire and said, "What do we do, Lieutenant, if they engage us?" emphasizing the word lieutenant. "We need to be careful that doesn't happen," said the lieutenant. Sergeant Evans spit into the fire again and then gave a smirk and said, "Ha!" Lieutenant MacRae looked at the patrol and said, "You men get some sleep. Sergeant, I'd like a word with you in private." Lieutenant MacRae and Sergeant Evans walked over to where the horses were picketed. Sergeant Evans lit up a cigar and said, "What's on your mind, Lieutenant?" "Sergeant, is there something you have against me? You seem to disagree with anything I say," said Lieutenant MacRae. Sergeant Evans drew on his cigar and then blew a cloud of smoke in the direction of Lieutenant MacRae and said, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about. What have I said that makes you feel that way?" "It's just the way you answer me, your inflection when you say sir and lieutenant," said Lieutenant MacRae. Sergeant Evans blew a puff of smoke in the air and said, "I ain't educated like you, Lieutenant. Hell, I don't even know what the word inflection means." "It's that snotty way you've been saying sir and lieutenant. I looked at your dossier before we left. You were a hero at Gettysburg. Twice you turned down a battlefield commission. Do you have a dislike for officers?" said the lieutenant. "You wouldn't understand, sir," said Sergeant Evans. "I'd really like to try," said Lieutenant MacRae, putting his arm on Sergeant Evans' shoulder. Sergeant Evans looked at Lieutenant MacRae in the eye, then stared at the ground and said, "During the war, I was a first sergeant in the Iron Brigade. At Gettysburg, I lost several good men because of some incompetent officer's bad judgment. He was fresh out of West Point and would not listen to us who had seen the elephant. I just could not bring myself to becoming an officer. I thought I could do more good by being close to the men. I think I do understand, Sergeant. Please, will you help me not make those kinds of mistakes? Said Lieutenant MacRae, extending his hand to Sergeant Evans. I'll try, sir, said Sergeant Evans, giving Lieutenant MacRae a faint sympathetic look while shaking the lieutenant's hand. Thank you, Sergeant, said the lieutenant. We won't have to worry about any war parties for a few days, but after that it will be difficult not to engage, said Sergeant Evans as he stepped on his cigar to put it out. Rain clouds appeared on the horizon as the patrol slowly moved along the Rosebud River. Lieutenant MacRae and Sergeant Evans were in the lead, with Corporal Dunn at the rear of the patrol. Since their private conversation, Sergeant Evans was helpful and polite to Lieutenant MacRae. The lieutenant gained a big measure of respect for Sergeant Evans and was grateful for the sergeant's advice. Now is the time to start being alert, said Sergeant Evans. Lieutenant MacRae was just about to speak when a rifle shot rang out. The shot grazed the side of the lieutenant's head. He fell unconscious and slumped in his saddle. Sergeant Evans grabbed the reins of Lieutenant's horse and shouted to the patrol, "Head for that clump of trees, move it." As the patrol moved towards the trees, Corporal Dunn and Private Nelson were immediately shot off with their horses. When the patrol finally entered the small grove of trees, only Sergeant Evans and Lieutenant MacRae were alive. Sergeant Evans heard the terrible screams of the rest of the patrol as they were scalped and killed. Sergeant Evans looked at Lieutenant MacRae and then drew his Colt revolver from the holster. Sergeant Evans looked up at the sky and sighed. He cocked the revolver and pointed it at Lieutenant MacRae, then had a change of heart. Just as Lieutenant MacRae regained consciousness, he heard a pistol shot ring out right next to him. As he opened his eyes, he saw Sergeant Evans slump over and fall to the ground. Smoke came out of the barrel of the sergeant's revolver, and blood gushed from a wound in his forehead. Tears welled up in Lieutenant MacRae's eyes. He heard the cries of his attackers and slowly stood up. As he stepped out from the cover of the trees, 8 Sioux warriors levered their Winchesters and put Lieutenant MacRae in their sights. Blood was flowing from the wound in his head. The leader of the war party looked at his fellow warriors and said, "Wait, don't shoot yet." Lieutenant MacRae drew his Colt revolver from the holster and pointed it towards the ground next to his feet. The warriors intensified their aim on Lieutenant MacRae. The lieutenant cocked the hammer and fired 6 rounds into the ground and then let the revolver fall. As the revolver hit the ground, Lieutenant MacRae lost consciousness again. The war party swarmed around Lieutenant MacRae. 3 warriors carried Lieutenant MacRae over to one of the dead troopers' horses. Lieutenant MacRae awoke to find himself spread-eagled and staked down on a mound of dirt. His head throbbed from the bullet wound. A Sioux warrior carrying a lance approached Lieutenant MacRae. The lieutenant recognized the scalp on the warrior's lance. It was Sergeant Evans' scalp. The warrior thrust the lance into the ground within inches of Lieutenant MacRae and drew his knife from a sheath. The warrior pressed the tip of the knife just below Lieutenant's neck. The warrior slowly moved the knife down the lieutenant's chest and stomach. The warrior said in broken English, "Now we will see how brave you are, white man." Lieutenant MacRae remembered the sergeant's words about saving the last bullet for yourself, and he started to tremble. Just then, a voice rang out in Sioux, and a man dressed in a sack suit said, "Stop, we are not animals." The man appeared to be a Sioux. He He was tall for an Indian and had rugged but handsome features. His black hair was cropped close, and he spoke perfect English. The man was White Eagle, the son of Red Eagle. Lieutenant MacRae looked at White Eagle and lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was inside of a teepee. His clothes were in a neat pile next to him. Lieutenant MacRae dressed and then opened the flap on the teepee. An Indian warrior put a Henry rifle across the opening and said, "Stay." Lieutenant MacRae reluctantly obeyed the warrior's command and sat down on a buffalo robe. It was warm in the teepee, and he started to perspire. Within a few minutes, the flap opened, and White Eagle appeared in the opening. He surveyed Lieutenant MacRae and then entered the teepee. White Eagle was still wearing the sack suit. The coat was open and revealed a Smith & Wesson revolver tucked into his pants. He had a serious but somewhat friendly look on his face. White Eagle looked at Lieutenant MacRae and said, "You were either very brave or very foolish to surrender like you did. You could have been killed or tortured on the spot. Why didn't you do what your sergeant did?" "I'm a Christian and I believe in a hereafter. We are taught that if we die by our own hand, we will burn in hell for all eternity." "Who are you? Why did you save me? What are you planning to do with me?" said Lieutenant MacRae. "I am White Eagle, the son of Red Eagle. Nothing will happen to you. You are free to go." "I thank you for that and also for saving my life. My mission was to investigate reports of Red Eagle's band attacking settlers on the Rosebud. I had strict orders not to engage your people, just to investigate." "May I speak with your father?" said Lieutenant MacRae. White Eagle took on a serious look again and said, "My father is dying. He will not last much longer. I am in charge, so to speak. There have been attacks and raids by our warriors, but not at my father's command. We have some young warriors who do not want to give up the old ways. After my father dies, I am to become chief. That may not happen. The young warriors will resist my becoming chief. That is why I carry a gun. They resented my father sending me out east to the white man's schools. I was sent out to New York to live and study with a missionary doctor and his wife. The doctor saved my mother when she was dying from the pox. My father wanted me to learn about the white man's medicine and healing powers. The doctor had great influence, and he sent me to Harvard to study. I have seen the white man's power and knowledge. Our people must change, but they find it hard to change after the way they have been treated. Broken treaties, broken promises, reservations with deplorable conditions, the land where we lived on for centuries, taken away from us without any compassion. I must tell you that the blame for this current state of affairs rests on both sides. We need to change. Washington needs to keep their promises and not break treaties. "I will tell my superiors what you have told me," said Lieutenant MacRae. "You must leave here tomorrow. When my father dies, I may not be able to protect you," said White Eagle. The next day at sunset, Lieutenant MacRae was given his horse Mac back to him, along with a single-action Army Colt and a Springfield carbine. He offered to shake White Eagle's hand, but White Eagle turned away and said, "Leave quickly." Lieutenant MacRae stopped at the battle site and buried Sergeant Evans and the rest of the patrol. He sobbed as he buried Sergeant Evans and said, "I'll never forget you, Sergeant." He brought back with him whatever personal effects of the dead troopers he could salvage. Lieutenant MacRae arrived back at Fort Keogh late in the afternoon the following day. He immediately reported to his commanding officer, Major George Stone. The major was a short and portly man with not a single hair on his head. He would joke with Sergeant Evans about not having to worry about getting scalped. At first, Major Stone was skeptical about Lieutenant MacRae's story and he threatened the lieutenant with a court-martial for cowardice in the face of the enemy. Major Stone scoffed at Lieutenant MacRae's story about his conversations with White Eagle. He said the Indians were treated fairly, and he called John MacRae an Indian lover. The major finally accepted Lieutenant MacRae's report after the lieutenant offered to take Major Stone out to the gravesite of the dead troopers. Major Stone took a dislike to Lieutenant MacRae. He would continually question Lieutenant MacRae's judgment, sometimes in front of the entire troop. Within 6 months, Lieutenant MacRae would ask for a transfer. His wish was finally granted, and he was transferred to the newly opened Fort Meade near Sturgis, South Dakota. Soon after arriving at Fort Meade, Lieutenant MacRae heard that Major Stone personally led a patrol and attacked Red Eagle's band. Almost all of the warriors were killed. The remaining few warriors, women, children, and old men were captured and sent to a reservation in Oklahoma. White Eagle was nowhere to be found. Major Stone was heard to say, "I don't think there ever was a White Eagle." Lieutenant MacRae never did find out what happened to White Eagle. Lieutenant MacRae was now Captain MacRae. During the past 12 years, he served with distinction, mostly at frontier forts in Wyoming and Montana. In 1889, Captain MacRae found himself stationed again with the 7th Cavalry at Fort Riley, Kansas. When he reported to Colonel Forsyth, the commanding officer of the 7th Cavalry, Captain MacRae was told that the colonel did not want him assigned to the 7th Cavalry because of Captain MacRae's reputation for being too sympathetic to Native Americans. The colonel and the captain did not get along from their very first meeting, and they avoided each other as much as possible. The event that followed on December 29, 1890, was known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Captain MacRae was visibly shaken and ashamed by the events that occurred on that cold December day in 1890. He could never forget the image of Chief Bigfoot lying frozen in the snow with his hand reaching up towards the sky. Upon returning to Fort Riley, Captain MacRae turned in his resignation from the military. Just before he left Fort Riley, Captain MacRae received a telegram from his mother in Milwaukee. His father was dying, and he wanted to see his son one last time. Captain MacRae thought of his father's belittlements to him and sent a telegram back to his mother declining the visit. He was about to purchase a horse when he reconsidered his decision. Captain MacRae boarded a train for Chicago and then on to Milwaukee. John MacRae arrived in Milwaukee on a cold, snowy evening and immediately went to his parents' home. When he arrived, his mother told him that his father had passed away that morning. She told him that his father wanted to set things straight with his son before passing. Mr. MacRae told his wife that he regretted the way he treated his son. Mrs. MacRae said that in his father's will, the entire cigar business was left to his son, John MacRae. John told his mother he did not want any part of the business. The business was the source of the tensions between himself and his father. John MacRae took his mother's hand and said, "Mother, you keep the cigar business. It will give you a nice, steady income." "What will you do?" said his mother. "I've been offered a position as the paymaster in a gold mine in South Dakota." "Why don't you come out there with me? The country is beautiful," said John MacRae. His mother teared up and said, "No, Johnny, I will stay here. I do not want to be a burden to you. I want to be buried next to your father." John MacRae helped his mother organize her affairs and arranged for a longtime employee to help run the cigar factory. John MacRae telegraphed the mine that he would be on his way. He boarded a train for South Dakota. He stopped in Sturgis and purchased another sorrel. This sorrel resembled Mac. He again named his horse Mac. John MacRae headed out to the Homestake mine in Leeds, South Dakota, to report for his new position as the mine paymaster. John MacRae decided to stay in Deadwood overnight before reporting to the mine. As he rode into the outskirts of Deadwood, he noticed that a carpenter was putting the finishing touches on a gallows. John MacRae's curiosity got the best of him. He dismounted Mac and walked over to the carpenter and said, "Who's getting hung?" The carpenter put his hammer on the railing and said, "An Indian who calls himself John Eagleton. Someone said he was the son of Red Eagle." "What did he do?" said John MacRae. "Oh, the son of a bitch raped and killed the wife of a big rancher's son who lives a few miles from here," said the carpenter. John MacRae took his hat off. He ran his hand through his hair and said, "You don't say. Where is this Indian being held?" "In the city jail." "Why do you ask?" said the carpenter. John MacRae put his hat back on and said, "Oh, nothing, just curious. Thanks for the information. Oh, by the way, what did this Indian look like?" "He didn't look like an Indian. He dressed like a white man, and he owned a general store in town," said the carpenter. John MacRae mounted Mac and tipped his hat to the carpenter. As John MacRae headed into Deadwood, he thought of his experience many years ago with White Eagle. John MacRae looked at his pocket watch. It was 3 p.m. He decided to visit the condemned man. The jail was in the Deadwood City Hall. It was a large 3-story brick building. It was on a corner in downtown Deadwood and easy to find. The jail was in the basement. The jailer refused to let John MacRae visit the condemned man. John MacRae persisted. The jailer finally agreed to a visit after John MacRae said he was in the cavalry and possibly had some dealings with the condemned man. The jailer picked up a double-barrel shotgun. He opened it up, inserted 2 shells. They went down a stairway into the jail area. The jailer unlocked the steel door and motioned for John MacRae to follow him into the cell area. As John MacRae approached the cell, the condemned man stood up and walked up to the bars that held him prisoner. He firmly grabbed a steel bar with each hand. The jailer pointed to a yellow line on the floor 3 feet from the bars. The jailer pointed to the line and said, "Don't go beyond that yellow line or I'll throw you out of here." The condemned man was White Eagle. White Eagle looked at John MacRae and said, "How did you find me, Lieutenant?" White Eagle was wearing a brown tweed sack suit. The suit was wrinkled and dirty. The coat was unbuttoned. White Eagle's face bore some bruises. "I'm not a lieutenant anymore. I resigned from the military, and I'm on my way out to the gold mine in Lead. I'll be working there as the mine paymaster. I noticed a gallows being built as I rode into Deadwood. They said an Indian by the name of John Eagleton was going to hang for rape and murder. They said this Indian was the son of Red Eagle. I just couldn't believe that the White Eagle I knew could commit such an act," said John MacRae. White Eagle released his grip on the bars and said, "Would it make any difference to you if I said I was innocent?" "Of course it would. I could never envision you doing anything like rape or murder. Tell me how you ended up here. I want to help you," said John MacRae. White Eagle put his hands through the bar and said softly, "You can help me by handing me that knife you are wearing. I don't want to hang." John MacRae shook his head and said, "That I will not do." White Eagle said, "Please don't leave me like this. I don't want to hang like an animal." John MacRae ignored the remark. "How much time do you have left?" said John MacRae. White Eagle said, "They are going to hang me in 4 days." "Tell me how you ended up here. I heard your camp was raided by Major Stone. He said you were nowhere to be found. I never heard what happened to you. It was like you disappeared from the face of the earth," said John MacRae. White Eagle said, "My father died 2 days after you left." Just before he died, he spoke to all of the men in our band and said he wanted me to be chief. There were conflicts between the young warriors and the older men in the band. The older men wanted peace with the white men. The young warriors wanted to continue their raids. For a while, I was able to maintain order. The young warriors eventually grew restless and raided another homestead on the Rosebud. I protested and wanted to punish the raid leaders. One of the elders told me that the raid leaders planned to have me killed that evening. That evening, I heard two warriors approaching my teepee. I ended up killing both of them and barely escaping. There was nothing left for me there. I wanted to get away as far as possible, so I headed to California. With my education, I was able to earn a good living. I managed to save enough money to buy the store here in Deadwood. I heard that. Just then the jailer stood up. He interrupted White Eagle and said, "That's enough for today, let's go." "What time can I visit him tomorrow?" said John MacRae. "No more visits for you," said the jailer. John MacRae reached into his pocket and pulled out a $50 gold piece. He handed it to the jailer and said, "What time tomorrow?" The jailer put the gold piece in his vest pocket and said, "Come back tomorrow morning after 10 o'clock. John MacRae looked at White Eagle and said, "I will see you tomorrow. Oh, by the way, do you have a wife or any kin out here?" "I had a wife, but she died from typhus a few years ago. She was with child. I miss her terribly, but I'm glad she isn't here to see this," said White Eagle as he sat down on the pallet. "Come on, let's go. That's enough for one day," said the jailer impatiently.